Welcome, everybody. Welcome to American history, the 1950s and early 1960s, focusing on the domestic issues. The 1950s, in my mind, is much like the 1990s, a decade of affluence, amazing technological progress, and abundance. It's a decade of economic growth, of amazing technological change, and a decade of consumerism, consumer growth, consumer products, consumer um, stuff that people now have access to buying. It's also a decade where a lot of American issues get ignored, left behind, forgotten about. Certainly, minorities. The story that we've been talking about and talking about all semester are excluded from this story of abundance and amazing economic progress. It's pretty amazing. We forgot about the civil rights movement is going to start in the 1950s, but it's going to take until the 1960s to really get going. We'll talk more about this next class. But certainly, minority groups, especially African Americans and especially Native Americans, not to leave anybody out, are going to be left behind and kind of excluded from this decade of amazing prosperity, stability, and economic growth. And so there's almost two 1950s, depending on who you are. There's this great 1950s of stability, wonderment that we all look back on with nostalgia. And then there's this 1950s where we see the start of desegregation in schooling, but really the continuation of the denial of basic constitutional rights to our fellow Americans. And this isn't a decade of progress or abundance or affluence at all. It's a decade of willful ignorance and exclusion. It's also a decade of vile political attacks and political hysteria due to the Cold War. And we'll get to these communist fears and red scares in a minute. And so there's all these interesting, complex ideas and aspects to the 1950s that make it a fascinating and amazing decade, but also one that kind of punts, that forgets, that willfully excludes. And so it's certainly a decade that examines, that needs further examination. It's a decade of rock and roll, right? It's a decade where rock and roll really gets started, drawing upon different genres of music. Rock and roll is really the fusion of blues, rhythm and blues, country all coming together. Certainly, there's some elements of jazz and using the electric guitar, electric bass drums, with one or more singers to create this amazing excitement, vibrant energy, right? This kind of new up tempo, fast, often electric modern music that's certainly going to appeal to a new audience and new generation of American consumers. Right? You can see probably the iconic father, maybe father, depending on how you want to look at it, of rock and roll. Certainly one of its first major celebrities, Elvis, on the top right. I mean, to be a celebrity known by your first name only, to have this instant recognition is pretty amazing. And then you can see the Beach Boys included out of my own personal nostalgia and reverence for my parents who are big Beach Boys fans. That's kind of thrown in there too. Certainly not the trailblazers or the inspirational musicians that others are, but still pretty good rock and roll band that makes some pretty catchy music and with a few albums that kind of are pushing the genre to some degree. But the idea here is that we have this perfect storm where this new music bursts onto the scene, drawing upon older traditions, and is able to take advantage and appeal and target itself at this new generation of baby boomers who are gradually starting to come of age and market itself directly to them. So by the time the Beatles burst on the scene in the 1960s, we have kind of this full force teenage hysteria combining with one of the most gifted rock groups of all time to create this new rock supergroup. Again, not to take anything away from Elvis Presley or the Beach Boys, but this new music is highlighting the technology, the excitement, the sense of wonderness and newness of the age. That's all pretty amazing. And to some degree, there's some cultural appropriation. To some degree, there's discrimination. To some degree, there's just um, the large scale exclusion of African American musicians. But it does highlight, I think, this new age of consumerism, this new generation of baby boomers, and this new age of music. So, what's going on in the 1950s? Stability, prosperity, again, not for everybody, for many people. The U.S. economy is growing, expanding at a rate of 3.5% per year over this 25-year period. It's amazing, right? Growth, 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 growth. A 25-year period of growth until 1970 when the oil crisis really comes in and American spending in Vietnam really catches up to itself is going to cause some problems, right? The expectation is full employment, unemployment at record lows, right? People expect to get a job. And again, yeah, women are being excluded from the workplace or being relegated to second tier positions. And certainly not everybody has access to the manufacturing and white collar jobs that are really driving America at this point. And there's certainly some racial elements to it as well. But just imagine that, right? The expectation of full employment, the expectation that everybody has a job, record low unemployment rates. This is an amazing aspect of American history, right? This generation that survived, that suffered through the Great Depression, that fought in the Second World War, now comes home, they start a family, they're buying houses, and they're experiencing this unprecedented economic growth and period of economic stability, right? Just growth, employment, and stability being the key words. Right? Consumerism and the consumption of goods is also amazing, right? The GDP skyrocketing up 36%. Wages are going up. Personal consumption expenditures are skyrocketing, right? People are buying stuff. They're buying stuff for the house. They're buying cars. They're buying houses. People are spending money. They're participating in this vastly growing consumer economy, everything from food to cars. They're just purchasing. They have the money, they have the jobs, they have the economic confidence that they want to participate in this economic miracle, this economic stability. And again, this generation had largely been denied stuff really until 1945. And all of a sudden, the 50s come along. They're going to spend money and they're going to buy the stuff that's available to them. What else do they get? Higher wages. Real wages grow, right? The amount of money that you get to take home as after accounting for inflation grows. This is in the last 20 years, we haven't seen this. And then from the present day, the last 20 years, we've barely seen this. But people have the ability to buy more stuff, right? Their income growth is outpacing inflation. Every year they can buy more things, their wages go up. The labor market has a shortage of workers, and so the workers can demand and get wages, both in the manufacturing and in the white collar sectors. Again, some aspects of the economy, certainly small scale farming and certainly mining, are not part of this economic miracle, but most people get access to higher, secure wages. You're pretty much guaranteed a job for life. Not in the Japanese model, but a fairly strong, stable economy and a fairly strong expectation of growth. Paid vacations, folks, right? You get to go on vacation. And hopefully you can see the tie between economic growth and consumer spending, right? You get more time off. What do? You go on vacation. You travel. Go in the family car. You go to the beach. What are you doing at the beach? You're spending money here. You have to rent hotel rooms, buy food, participate in the local economy. And this just fuels more economic growth and economic momentum. Social Security, right, is now kicking in. So even older folks have money. Right, this generation of people that were really lost their jobs in the 1930s and witnessed the economic scarcities in the 1940s. Now they're the first generation that gets to benefit from Social Security. Historically, elderly people are ignored in the economy. Now they're becoming greater and greater consumer agents and at least having stability, right? They have stability. They know that their next month's check is coming in the mail from the government in terms of Social Security. Also, private pension plans. You get paid not to work. You get paid after retirement. So now you have some investments, you have a pension, and you have Social Security. This is going to be what financial planners call the holy trinity of post-retirement economic success. It doesn't really function that way anymore, but from the 1950s really through the early 2000s, you have this trifecta that's put in place in the 1950s. Pensions, Social Security, some investments, you're set for your retirement, right? So you get to continue participating in this consumer revolution and consumer economy after you're retired. Educational opportunities, you can move up in class. Colleges and universities now are accessible, which again is historically unique, historically rare. And Americans from the 1950s almost have this expectation of going to college that continues to this day. You graduate from high school, you go to college. Again, I'm not saying everybody, but I'm saying it's this expectation, right? Or this access that is fairly unique with the idea and the hope that these educational opportunities will provide for class mobility, right? And what we see is the rise and transition from the working class to the middle class, right? You're owning your own home, you have your own automobile, you have all these consumer goods, you have an advanced degree, you're moving up in class, baby. You're part of the middle class. And where are you living? You're living in the suburbs. That by 1960 are housing a third of people. The trend of urbanization that we talked about in the 19th century is now being one of deurbanization in the 20th century. Well, people are leaving cities to go to the suburbs. All right. And we're starting to see the rise of corporatization, these big, powerful corporations at the expense of the decline of smaller businesses. Look at McDonald's, right? They figure out a better way to fry a hamburger and some French fries. All of a sudden, they're out competing, they're out growing, they're out muscling these smaller hamburger joints. They can move in. Everybody knows what McDonald's is. People are going to go to McDonald's. It's modernity. It's fresh. It's stable. It's appealing. You know what's there, and so now you have this big, massive hamburger chain, business, international business that nobody really thought of prior to this becomes like the model for franchising and for businesses from the 1950s onward. But again, the number of Americans continuing to live in poverty, especially and disproportionately minority Americans, is actually quite high. Right here, you can see economic growth, pretty cool, pretty amazing, right? 1920s, pretty good, right? Pretty good expectation and economic growth. Again, mostly confined to white middle class, and especially the upper class. And then the depression comes along, poof, everything kind of plummets. After the Depression, things grow, right? Thanks to Roosevelt, with some limitations and with some controversy. World War II really pushes everybody out. And then what we see is this upward trajectory from the 1940s onward with the GI Bill, right? This GI Bill is going to provide access to education. And again, the genius of it is that it mitigates the demilitarization and demobilization of the soldiers, right? You have all these soldiers in the army, millions and millions of people. Instead of just letting all these millions of soldiers loose on the job market, which will cause chaos and unemployment, at least in theory, let's figure out a way to give them benefits, cash payments of tuition, right? Let's get some of them not in the job market and going to schools, right? The job market can only absorb so many people. We'll take some of these people and say, hey, why don't you go to school, right? Attend university, high school, vocational school, unemployment compensation, right? Not to mention low-cost mortgages, which we'll see in a minute, is important, or interest, low interest loans to start a business, right? You're not going to take somebody else's job, right? We have this labor pool. Let's just give you money to start your business so you're not either unemployed yourself or causing somebody else to be unemployed. Right? So like World War I witnessed this massive economic hiccup after the war. But now World War II, for reasons we talked about last class and this class, especially regarding the GI Bill, is going to mitigate the demobilization problems that occur. Right? Instead of millions of people flooding the job market, let's kind of push them all around. Let's send some of the schools, send some of the businesses. Let's encourage consumerism by allowing them to start a business or let them buy a house. Guess what? And all of a sudden they need to pay a contractor, pay for building supplies, do all this stuff to buy their house. It's going to further stimulate jobs, further stimulate the U.S. economy, right? And so low interest loans are great for pushing a building boom, which we'll see in a minute has important ramifications. 2.2 million veterans go to high school, go to college. All right, another 5.6 billion for vocational training. The government's paying you to do this, right? The government's paying for your tuition. Why not take advantage of it? You made a sacrifice to your country. Now let the country make a sacrifice to you. And this expectation that the GI Bill will help soldiers from lower income families that don't have the same access to higher education continues to this day, right? The legacy is that you go in the military, you serve your time, deployment 2 years, you come out, you have access to GI Bill funding for schools. You see it happen all the time that the government will subsidize your education in exchange for you serving the country. But again, it's discriminatory, just like everything in the 1950s. I'm not trying to make light of it. It's just the constant theme is like there's this great program, but it's not for everybody. So many veterans of color aren't benefiting, again, because it's directed out by local white officials. This is the problem that we've seen all semester. These local white officials cause problems. They get in the way of these ideas and stuff coming from Washington, right? They get in the way of equal treatment of Native Americans, equal treatment after the Civil War of African Americans. They get in the way of equal treatment of minority Americans with the GI Bill, right? They find a way to muck up the works. They find a way to push stability and limit access to these programs to white Americans. So, unfortunately, what we see time and time again is local officials kind of mess things up and allow for discriminatory practices to continue. Right, and then again, this continues. The cash payment kind of goes away, and that is going to be limited to people that have served X amount of time, right? But again, it's a great way to get people from the working class into the middle class, because what do you need to join the middle class? You need an education. How do you afford an education? You can't unless you join the military, and then you could take advantage of all these schools. It also provides for this massive expansion of colleges and universities, something that I can personally benefit from, right? Because what do you need at a college and university? You need workers. First, you need to build it, to staff it, to run it, and to teach at it. And so in the 1950s, really through the 1970s, we're going to witness this massive expansion of education, right? Because once one generation goes to college, the expectation is that they're middle class, their kids are going to go to school. And so the more people go to school after World War II, the more people are going to want to go to college or university um, from the baby boom generation that's following. Again, transition to middle class. You have education, you have a business, you have vocational training. Guess what? You're middle class. My grandfather got vocational training. He started his own little tobacco farm. And by the 1960s, he was driving around in a Cadillac. I'm not saying he was rich. He was just, had this solid middle class background. That's very much right. The consumerism of the day. Technology is changing people's lives, right? For farms, it's transitioning from these small family-owned farms to large corporate farms. Why? Because you can farm a lot more with technology, right? You have the better machines, the better tractors, the better crop harvesters. You're able to just use technology for bigger, more productive farming. Televisions, right? 1950s, 77% of households, 77% of households. That's an amazing statistic. Are purchasing their first television set, right? And we get to see classic TV shows, I Love Lucy, that are designed by these legendary television personalities. People are watching TV, and basically the modern television network, modern television genres like the sitcom, and even the modern kind of TV lineup that shows premiere in the fall to coincide with the release of a new year of cars. They need the advertising, they need the new shows. Is born, right? So we have this expectation that September comes along, we're going to get a new wave of TV shows and comedies and stuff to watch on TV after a summer of just watching reruns and being bored out of our mind by watching baseball games. All of a sudden, boom, cool new shows come out in September. This is something that develops in the 1950s in the format, right? 7 minutes of TV, 3 minutes of commercials, 7 minutes of TV, 3 minutes of commercials, or something like that. Although certainly now the TV shows have certainly shrunk. It used to be like 25 minutes, and then 23 minutes. It's now like 22 minutes for a standard half-hour sitcom comedy, and then kind of the whole thing, right? The whole laugh track idea, the whole studio audience idea, kind of these kind of fairly innocuous but still situationally funny comedies designed to appeal to as many people as possible come out of the 1950s, right? The space race, right? And so we have this race to get people first into space and then eventually into the moon, oftentimes using captured Nazi scientists, but there's a desire to beat the USSR. What does this mean for us? It's going to demonstrate the new technological wonderness of the age. Now we're going to have stuff circulating around the Earth, right? These artificial satellites. But we also are going to see this huge increase in technological and industrial productivity, right? All these things that are being invented as part of the space race, including satellites, all of a sudden have amazing consumer appeal and consumer function as well, right? So the more money that's being poured into R&D, research and development over here is going to have a corresponding effect eventually in productivity and consumer products and industrialization. And so the two go hand in hand, right? The more technology is developed over here, the more changes you see over here. And guess what? Polio, the scourge of the ages, this disease that kills and makes a lot of people unable to walk. Guess what? It's going to be conquered. It's going to be conquered by a guy, Jonas Salk, who's actually going to give his invention, his vaccine away for free so that everybody has access to it, right? What a guy. And then we see the rise of mass production of penicillin, that you're not going to get sick, right? That you can conquer these diseases and these germs, these wonder drugs that allow humans to go after these problems that have bothered them and scourged them for ages. It's also this decade of kind of technological expectation, right? The more stuff gets conquered, kind of the higher expectations are that technology is going to save us, but of course, it also leads into this massive increase in life expectancy, which again shouldn't be that surprising considering the problems of the 1930s and the global war and instability of the 1940s. But polio, penicillin, access to cheaper consumer goods is really going to help push up the whole level of life, right? Of life expectancy. The problem is that today we're eating kind of we're dealing with the byproduct of all this, right? We have super resistant viruses and diseases out there, right? That is capable of resisting penicillin. We have all these consumer goods that make us lazy. We don't even have to get off the TV now to change the channel. We don't even have to change a channel anymore. We can just tell our technology to do it for us. And certainly with the rise of processed food at McDonald's, is this causing us to become more and more obese and overweight, which again, really for the first time in history, we're seeing, the first time in the last 200 years, we're seeing this decrease in life expectancy, which is interesting as well. Here's your middle class household, right? All sorts of things here. The kids, 3 kids, good middle class life, the tranquil picture on the wall, gathered around the TV, drinking Coke, consumerism at its finest. The father's kind of fiddling around with it, right? Kind of highlighting his connection between the technology and gender. The housewife is confined over here, almost ignored in the background of the family. She's reading a paper, right? She's almost the furthest removed from this whole television setup altogether. And we start to see families gathering around the TV now for family bonding time instead of, I don't know, gathering on the radio or playing games with each other, right? So this new mass leisure society is going to be a mass isolation society as well, because what did people do for fun in the 1920s and 1930s? They went to movies, they went out to drink, they went out to amusement parks, right? They hung out outside of the house. What are people doing for amusement, for fun, for relaxation in the 1950s and 1960s? And then, of course, by the 1970s and 1980s, they're sitting at home, relaxing in front of the television. I'm really not talking with each other. And in Britain, the problem's even worse. People would go to the pub every Sunday to watch the soccer match. Now, 1950s, 1960s comes along. It's a bit later in Britain. They're just staying at home to watch the football match, right? So they're not interacting as much as they had in the past, right? People are now confined by the walls here, right? They get to invite entertainment to them, which is great and easy and wonderful and a massive change, rather than having to go out and experience leisure outside of the house in a much more public dynamic. The other issue is that a lot of these technological changes are designed to make housekeeping easier, vacuums, washing machines, et cetera, et cetera. But do they really? Certainly to some degree. But they also lead to decreasing need for domestic servants and maids, which is pushing that whole occupation out the window. All right, and where are these people living? Get a sense that they're in the suburbs, right? They have this relatively spacious living room, chimney, tranquil country painting on the background, matching sofa affluence, and of course, they're white. So what we have is this continuation of a trend going back to the 19th century that takes advantage of improving railroads and certainly improving technology with the automobile and access to the automobile. But it's going to take off in the post-World War II generation, right? What we have is the development of zoning laws, redlining, and changes in transportation that makes it easier to go from the suburbs into the cities, right? The rise of mass highways being pushed by Eisenhower, which makes like every 30 miles has to be exactly straight to be used as a runway in case of times of war. So there's sort of a military background to the Eisenhower interstate travel system. But it's just easier than ever to take either public transportation or now to drive using this developing highway system into the city, which allows for more Americans to move out of the city. Why do you want to move out of the city? Well, space is a good one, right? You have this kind of cramped Brooklyn, Manhattan apartment. You need more space. Now you're having fewer kids, but you want to give these kids more space. You want to give these kids access to the outdoors. You're not going to move to the countryside, but you want this backyard. You want these roads that they can play in. You want a bit more privacy, right? You don't want your neighbors knowing your business just like they do in the cities. Of course, I would argue in the suburbs, it's pretty similar as well. But what you see is this need for privacy, this need for space, and this need to kind of escape the influx of African Americans into these previously ethnic enclaves of the city, pushing people out. Right, you have this kind of fear, this racial fear that you might have African American families moving into an Italian neighborhood where you're going to have this symptom known as white flight, in which then the Italian Americans are going to move out to the suburbs, right? They want to move away from the perceptions or allegations of the crime and the levels of violence of the city. Again, this is just completely stereotyped and racially exaggerated. But it's going to be a redrawing of the racial segregations of the American life, right? You need to create a better world in your mind for your kids, for yourself. You're going to move out. All right, and so we have this new pattern of hyper-segregation where class and race are very well mixed, and you're going to be characterized by these groupings of different races, where you're going to have white flight to the suburbs, leading to this sense of urban decay as the tax base decreases. And then by the 1960s, as the industrialization decreases, that's going to lead to problems for the inner city, right? We're going to have those who can afford it leaving those who can't afford it and need more public assistance staying, causing all sorts of issues. Right, this is going to be compounded, kind of ironically, by this need for new infrastructure. So this desire to create access to the suburbs through highways is going to really destroy a lot of these old inner city neighborhoods. They're just going to bulldoze right through them. Right, we need these highways to go through Manhattan. Let's just push our way through the inner city neighborhoods that exist, dividing them right now. You can't go from this street to this street, even though they're literally like 2 blocks away, because there's this huge 8-lane interstate between the two neighborhoods, or dividing that neighborhood. This is going to then further white flight because now it's easier, and the neighborhood that they grew up in is being destroyed. So it's kind of ironic, right? To further access to the suburbs, you're destroying the neighborhoods that then push the need for more suburbs. And of course, there's going to be laws such as in Levittown, near where I live, that from the 1940s onward actually prohibit you from buying a house if you're not white, and they put it on your deed that you actually can't sell a house if you can't sell a house to somebody who's not white. All right, there's going to be very clear prohibitions on the access to the suburbs of minorities, right? And you're going to enshrine it either in law, or you're going to enshrine it by society. The newspaper that I read in Long Island, they actually did a huge expose about a year ago, just before, about how real estate agents actually further this racial divide by just showing white families, areas in white white families areas of kind of white neighborhoods. They show African American families, regardless of ability to pay, areas in African American communities, right? And so they're reinforcing these racial divides and kind of using kind of racial and class stereotypes to figure out exactly where you want to live. Oh, you don't want to live in this town because you really won't fit in. You want to live over here. And of course, there's going to be further complications because the suburbs are going to have this increasingly increased ability to pay for better schools and so on and so forth, which is going to further this racial class and educational divide, right? So the idea here is that these suburbs, while they're great in theory and allow for this kind of amazing new development to occur, right, with these spacious homes, nice little yards, kind of like the picket fences that you're thinking about, and this kind of mass-produced tract housing in these planned neighborhoods with easy access to the highways, et cetera, well, they're actually also reinforcing racial segregation, racial stereotyping, and furthering the divide between those that have access to things like quality education and those that don't. So there's kind of important social, economic, and legal implications. You can kind of see the one remaining farmhouse over here, right? But these are just perfectly planned neighborhoods. Every lot is exactly the same. The houses are relatively similar. Maybe you have 2 or 3 different models to pick from. You might get lost because you have to count right which house is theirs. It's like the 5th one in from the corner because all the other ones look exactly the same. And again, the other thing is that you're going to have a lot of white Americans are going to have access to low interest mortgage rates due to the GI Bill that are going to be denied to African Americans. And they're also going to have access to mortgages. By and large, banks are going to be more willing to lend to whites than to members of different minority groups simply based on race. But you can see kind of a cool picture of this perfectly planned suburban community here, Levittown, and then it gets condensed to Levittown, New York. So these new cities, they're going to be full of highways and day workers, right? People that come in, they work their job, and then they go home. They're going to be increasingly racialized, right? That African Americans and other minorities are going to be confined to the cities, where whites are increasingly going to the suburbs, and then they're going to this racial flight to white flight is going to be further compounded by unscrupulous neighbors and real estate agents who just say, oh, "Did you hear there's a minority moving into our neighborhood? We better sell now." And of course, they're just kind of making all this stuff up. They just want to sell your house for you. And so, right, there's all these kind of rumors and innuendos that are circulating around that compound the problem as well. But you can just see, right, segregation in 1957. This one junior high school in Baltimore, has 2,000 white students and 34 black students. 10 years later, it has 12 white students and 2,000 black students. This other high school, the student body shifts from 2,500 whites and 12 blacks to 300 whites and 1,200 blacks in that same period, right? And so the desegregation in the schools now is occurring, but it's going to be resegregation because the white students and their families have left, leaving the 2,000 black students there. So these black students have access to the school. It's been desegregated, but it's been resegregated in the fact that there's no white students there anymore. And what you can see over time is that the public funding for this school is probably going to go down. Again, it's not guaranteed that'll happen, but it's just going to be compounded by the working class population declining and the overall loss of the industrial jobs due to the decreasing need for heavy industry. So you have this white flight out to the white collar jobs in the suburbs, leaving on African Americans in the inner city with this declining industrial base and declining access to education. That's probably going to get compounded over time because they're going to have a less of ability to pay for schools. Interestingly enough, though, the courts, they also ruling in favor of desegregation, which we'll go into next class. They're also allowing for the right to remain silent, your Miranda rights. So the Warren Court is kind of tied into all this in this desegregation process because you have these rights to education and this right to remain silent. Within Native American communities, you have this program or policy known as termination. This policy of termination is just going to be the federal government denying tribes the right to exist. Right, it's going to terminate these tribes based on lack of historical continuity, declining numbers, lack of membership, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's going to say, right, tribe XYZ no longer exists. It's been kind of terminated from the program. Either there's nobody in it anymore, it doesn't have any sort of identity anymore. It just simply doesn't exist anymore. And so I just threw this picture in because this picture kind of contrasts quite nicely with the suburbs. And so, right, definitely the Native American reservations aren't going through the same suburbanization as as Long Island is. Well, what does this mean? It means that there's going to be loss of federal funds for Native American tribes who get terminated, right? If you no longer exist as a tribe, the federal government doesn't have to pay for the tribe anymore, doesn't have to give the tribe money anymore. And so what we're going to see is declining access to education, once again, declining access to federal benefits, declining access to healthcare and health insurance. And so this can continue downward spiral of Native American communities due to this program of termination that in the late 1960s, early 1970s is going to be largely reversed. And I guess tribes are going to be reinstituted or unterminated. I'm not exactly sure what the opposite of termination is, but the process is going to ultimately reverse. And so Native Americans, just like African Americans, are going to be largely excluded and left behind during this era of prosperity and huge economic growth. Okay, the last point I want to highlight is the Red Scare. So we have Joseph McCarthy seen here, right? He's the guy that's pushing the Red Scare. And so what does he do? He makes a name for himself as a U.S. senator, and kind of this mediocre, kind of lowly senator, I guess. He hasn't really done too much in his political career, but he makes a name for himself. He becomes a kind of a national celebrity, and everybody knows who he is by making these sensational accusations that the communists have infiltrated all levels of the U.S. government. And during this Cold War hysteria, remember the Korean War is going on from 1950 to 1953, where we have the space race going on. We are concerned about Soviet expansion. The Soviets have just exploded an atomic bomb. They're starting to develop a hydrogen bomb, right? We're neck and neck. There's fears of Soviet invasion of Germany, of spilling over from Korea into Southeast Asia. China's goes communist in 1949. So there's this fear that the communists are winning the Cold War. There's a fear of communism everywhere, right? The United States is going to be the lone bastion of democracy and capitalism that exists. And guess what? According to McCarthy, the communists are already here. They're within our government. They're weakening us from within, folks. This is a problem. You can't have communist infiltration, right? We got to keep those, according to McCarthy, communists out. We have to identify where they are so we can eliminate them. And so McCarthyism becomes a practice of making accusations of disloyalty, subversion, or treason. These are big accusations. These are big crimes without any proper evidence. But during the period of the Red Scare, it's this mere idea that the accusation of being accused of being a communist is enough to get you blacklisted, to ruin your life, to have you lose your job, right? To experience all these massive, massive problems in your life without any evidence against you, right? Just the accusation of being communist is going to be problematic, right? Thousands of Americans are being accused of either being communist or communist sympathizers. How do you prove this? Well, McCarthy has lists. He has accusations. Maybe you made some questionable or even innocent comment that have been misinterpreted in your past. Maybe you participated in New Deal programs. Maybe you're a major New Deal supporter. Maybe you did a slightly left-leaning play or film. All of a sudden, you get grouped into this massive kind of amorphous blob of left-leaning liberals, socialists, communists that we're not really going to distinguish between, right? And so this idea that communism is a buzzword, right? It's this kind of accusation that you don't have to prove. And this goes back to the 1930s, where the New Deal is thought to be way too socialist, and it's going to be way attacked as communist altogether. But now it's just going to be reborn as this way of getting people out of the government, out of the army, out of Hollywood, ruin their careers, tarnish their reputations, get them prohibited from really working again. And so you have all these guys where they have to go through very aggressive investigations and questioning before the government, private industry panels, committees, agencies. And how do you prove you're something you're not, right? Kind of this negative accusation, negative acquittal, right? You can't prove something that, one, you don't know really what you're being accused of, and two, you can't really prove something that didn't happen. You can't prove a negative. And so your career is going to be in tatters, but you can't do anything to redeem yourself. You're going to be kind of blacklisted forever. Eventually, he goes too far. Eventually, McCarthy accuses the Army, right, the U.S. Army, of anti-U.S. leanings in televised hearings, right? He's kind of going after everybody. He's getting these bigger and bigger targets. He's going after these bigger and bigger institutions. And on television, he's accused by Army lawyer Joseph Welch of having no decency. Do you have no decency, sir? And the audience applauds. The spectators go crazy. They say, enough is enough, right? We can't keep this dangerous witch hunt going forever, right? But again, a number of individuals, their lives are simply derailed. And this idea of McCarthyism is thought of as certainly problematic. And it's this dark period of domestic American politics that I think really complicates this idea of the stability and prosperity and tranquility of the 1950s that we all have this seeming nostalgia for. And maybe rightly so, maybe not. Arthur Miller writes The Crucible, right? This play again about witchcraft, the Salem witch trials, but he kind of makes it against this Red Scare hysteria. He's kind of warning us this is what McCarthy's doing, right? He's just accusing people of being witches without any evidence of witchcraft because you can't prove it. And you can't prove you're not. That's the genius of it. And so the Red Scare becomes the buzzword of the day and highlights this fusion of Cold War tension with American domestic politics, and even during the era of the tranquility under Eisenhower, right? Eisenhower's kind of coasting. He's a beloved general, beloved politician. Both parties are courting him. He's not kind of this ideologue by any means. He has to deal with this firebrand, highlighting the fact that America might fall to communism at the end of the day, right? And McCarthy's going to warn us against it. Religion becomes more of a major issue because, again, it gives meaning to a lot of housewives, not just housewives, but for a lot of housewives who otherwise are lacking in any sort of larger political, economic, or social engagement shaping U.S. politics. And this is going to be a major trend that'll have major ramifications by the 1980s. But we do see the resurgence of organized religion in contrast to the secularization and forced secularization of society, right? The Supreme Court saying that you have to come apart, but more and more people are going to church, mostly because they have the time, the money, the affluence to go to church, but it is providing meaning to a lot of people's lives, which is important. And so, do we get a new society of abundance, of prosperity, of tranquility? Yeah, to some degree, but again, only if you're part of this middle class white group or higher, right? You have to be white, middle class, and mostly male to take advantage of all that this new society has to offer. And certainly, they're going to be the major winners of the economic growth of the 1950s. The increased access to education, the increased access to housing, and certainly the people left behind, Native Americans, African Americans, among others, women certainly as well, right? They're either going to be ignored, marginalized, forgotten about. are just kind of left to fend to themselves. And so certainly the prosperity is to some degree trickling down